还没有。
Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about business today. A little policy analysis of the Clean Air Act of 1970. This is for my Business 102 class for Ethics and Law and Business and Society. So here we go.
Wait a little bit.
Oh, just
Three means a lot. One too many. Yeah, one is okay. Two is too many. So three is perfect number. Three given.
Late.
People coming late. Maybe we just wait for wait for a couple minutes.
They come like in 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. All right. Sure, said I will be finished in 5 minutes.
And they all come all the way down.
oh yeah. Thanks for coming.
They say, oh, what are you doing right now? You just cannot wait, not finish. Some people maybe not there.
等一下会有一些 lights people 会来 deliver 那个 Gilbert 的 light。如果在 middle evening 的时候，你打开了之后，后面就可以。
哦，后面
对
deliver 可以啊。
对，就打开一下，就放它抓包。对，谢谢。
Okay, this clean air will covers the white cloud.
So not in this specifically kind of the deep dive analysis is for during the 1970s when they realized that there was a lot of pollution. That's when they started trying to implement this act. It actually started around 1960s, but during the 1960s, a lot of companies still didn't believe in science until 1970 when Richard Nixon kind of pushed for that mobilization to clean up the air, implement smog check for cars, stuff like that. Yeah. So he was like that inception, pushing this forward and making this like more, it's kind of responsible for kind of how we kind of approach it now.
So this is like a national act.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, we're
Federal act, yes.
Okay,
Yeah, we have Irish standards. Okay. Right, so this is the policy analysis of the Clean Air Act of 1970, and it was part of my Sino-American class for ethics, law, and business and society. So some topics we're going to discuss today: the general plan of the Clean Air Act, the history of the Act, establishment, development, and amending, implementation of the Clean Air Act. We're going to talk about the Act specifically, the code, and specific agencies involved. Impact on business and society, the policy analysis portion, conclusion, appendix, and some references. So brief introduction, Clean Air Act of 1970 was a federal law that kind of essentially standardizes and tracks air emissions into the natural environment. It was signed and registered on December 31st, 1970. By Richard Nixon, our 37th president. The law encourages citizens of the U.S. to recognize the rules of emission air quality and how we kind of approach to remedy this situation. The design of this act was to essentially control the pollution going into the air, and it's one of the first environmental laws that was implemented worldwide. Administered by the EPA. EPA was created on December 2nd, 1970, right before the registration of this act. The aim for this act was to sustain the health of American citizens, as well as raising awareness regarding our air quality issues that face today. It also aimed at reducing carbon emissions and other harmful chemicals that are a byproduct of chemical-related production and manufacturing activity. With the efforts and research from the EPA, the Clean Air Act is established built as one of the more certified acts in U.S. history, despite many slight modifications to accommodate the changing nature of our society. So how effective was this act? Quite clashing head-to-head with major companies and a lot of their business interests, the Clean Air Act has been affirmed its position today as one of the public goods, and it's also proven itself to be impactful to our country and a positive impact based on how much it costed to implement this act. As of 1990, we're talking about $523 billion in 1990s standards. The foundation of this act was to also observe how our environment kind of is impacted, while also improving our air quality and the quality of human health conditions. The Clean Air Act also kind of served as an important tool for the governments on both federal levels and state levels. At its inception, the EPA stationed research facilities throughout the U.S. in order to kind of geographically locate which specific chemical emissions corresponded to each of the topographical regions of the country. Policies with this act also aided in limiting the amount of pollution leaking out of corporation production plants. They imposed heavy fines on these corporations that have substantial excess emissions. One of the examples of the policies that the EPA has implemented is the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants, or otherwise known as NESHAP, which provides standards for harmful toxins in the air. Through NESHAP, the EPA inspects facility employees and also reviews reports and documentation regarding any pollution discharge. They do this so they can regulate the amount of gases released by corporations in their facilities. Little brief history of the act. After the conclusion of World War II and the start of a new chapter in history, it was clear that the U.S. had this old culture that was being slowly replaced by newer ideas and our newer way of life. Society seemed to be more proactive in caring about the natural environment, both social as well as eco-friendly ideals were being more recognized as a sort of like a brand new American mindset. As more and more corporations began to grow and expand, also increasing capital, their output of pollutants and other harmful toxins also increased. So as the years went by, American citizens began to realize how terrible these emissions were for the environment. Cities like Chicago and Houston, a population of over 2.5 million people, were sort of the first people to see the repercussions of pollution. A lot of smoggy mornings, hazy evenings, such being polluted to chemical fumes. This resulted in a lot of increases in asthma cases and other respiratory disabilities. And the rest of the general populace kind of discovered that it was more strenuous to simply just breathe. Citizens of Chicago and Houston realized that they didn't discover a way to reduce and diminish the output of pollution. Mother Nature would essentially suffer and possibly deteriorate beyond our repair. As for the rest of the U.S., it was made clear that societal anxieties needed an answer, which kind of led to Congress responding to the pollution problem. They executed a plan to minimize emission volumes of pollution in order to preserve the natural state of the world. Establishment of the Clean Air Act. So in the earlier years of the 1950s, there were already procedures created to be followed in order to formulate a way to deal with the aggregating growth of pollution. Congress then authorized and divided the Air Pollution Control Act, or APCA, in 1955. This is sort of the first draft of this act that Congress passed regarding the nation's clean air problem. APCA set the foundation for the future Clean Air Act in 1970 and led to the authorization of preliminary research around the quality of the domestic level. After this preliminary research, examiners learned that burning of fossil fuels from weapons and vehicle manufacturing was greatly damaging as well as impacting the air quality in the U.S. Since World War II, this was during this time period as well, it can be seen that the means of mass mobilization the support for the war was in fact met with environmental repercussions as well. So what happened before the formation of APCA? Before the creation of APCA, there were only a few states and local communities recognizing air pollution as a problem until the federal government realized that pollution affected the US nationally. Although APCA did very little to prevent further pollutants from entering our atmosphere, it allowed the government to see the effects of pollution on a national level. Nevertheless, APCA helped our government realize that programs focusing on the betterment of air quality was necessary. Since APCA lacked authority in enforcing the regulations that should have been implemented, President Nixon saw that it should be in the best interest of the US to have an environmental protection organization, which is the EPA. This program, now formally known as the Clean Air Act, would also aim to improve the quality of air and mitigate the long-term effects of pollution. Development of the Act. Despite the creation of APCA influencing the design of the 1960 version of the Clean Air Act, the first draft of this act was considered to be weak and illegitimate. Due to the lack of evidence needed to convince many members of Congress, most congressmen and women at the time did not support the Clean Air Act in the 1960s. Despite a majority agreement of needing to pass this act, President Nixon at the time asserted in his campaign speech that the US as a whole must be directed to work together to aid in reducing pollution. President Nixon's aim to educate and inform the US population about the carbon footprint society left after World War II brought attention to how damaging the air pollution was to our nation's clean air environment. With Nixon's authorization of the EPA and support from Congress after realizing the importance of clean air, the EPA was given power to reinforce the Clean Air Act of the 1960s, which later on developed into what we have now, which is the Clean Air Act of 1970. Amending the Clean Air Act Part 1, like many other prominent laws and regulations, the Clean Air Act of 1970 was not perfect. As effective as it was clear that the act needed to be amended in order to be fully enforced with its laws and regulations to essentially increase its presence and gain more power. The Clean Air Act was amended twice, once in 1977 and once in 1990. One of the major changes to the act was that it would require a reduction of carbon dioxide emissions from the automobile industry and its rapid gasoline consumption. This change was necessary to stand up against the rapid growth of car manufacturing companies, because the growth of these companies also instigated releasing harmful amounts of carbon emissions in the air. And as the 1970s came to an end, US citizens realized that releasing these carbon emissions into our atmosphere made it more difficult to breathe, as health-related complications began to increase as well. The purpose of this first amendment in 1977 was to regulate and improve gasoline consumption for motor vehicles, so the amount of carbon emissions released could be minimal. And in order to regulate this, the EPA indicated that smog checks were required for any automobiles that were made before the 1990s. Part 2, the second change made to the Clean Air Act was in 1990. Its intent was to notify the general populace about the effects of acid rain and ozone pollution, both of which are direct consequences from pollution. This was made to be an important issue because the acid rain and ozone pollution made devastating impacts to nature and other wildlife in America as well as around the world. As one of the most well-funded amendments ever made into a law, direct quote is: the direct costs of implementing the Clean Air Act from 1970 to 1990, including annual compliance expenditures in the private sector and program implementation costs in the public sector, is total to be about $523 billion, as mentioned in the introduction, in 1990s worth of dollars. The two amendments that made the Clean Air Act what it is today aided in the laws and guidelines regarding pollutant emissions for companies to abide by. The Clean Air Act also enables the U.S. to lessen the burden of the damage already dealt to Mother Nature. So this is President Nixon, the guy responsible for pushing this through Congress and kind of the mastermind behind the Clean Air Act of 1970. So researchers that were responsible for investigating how toxic emissions and air pollution were affected the environment was introduced to design of the Clean Air Act to Congress. They notified them of the increase in pollution as well as the possible rise in consequences involving both health and quality of air. After being introduced, this act was reviewed as a bill first by the House of Representatives and Senate, and later made into what is now the Clean Air Act after it was signed by President Nixon. Once it became a bill or draft version of the law, it was then implemented and then made into a federal law. Process of the Clean Air Act becoming official federal law also had a lot of hardships. For instance, in 1963, where the House of Representatives first drafted the Clean Air Bill, it lacked a lot of evidence to prove the decline of air quality and thus failed to be seen as important. Regardless of the hardships the Clean Air Bill went through, it became an act and received permission from Congress as well as a sizable budget to operate and dive deeper into researching pollution levels throughout the US. So on the left is the Clean Air Act copy. Find this in 42 US Code Chapter 85, Air Pollution Prevention and Control. This official code was organized after the Clean Air Act proposal in 1963 and aided in the process of obtaining resources and examination of the solutions for reducing pollutant emissions. According to US Code.house.gov, there are 6 subcategories to this, Chapter 85. Each of these categories go into depth by breaking down the Clean Air Act of the problems that needed to be discussed, how the problems should be solved, and why these problems need to be answered. Through the Clean Air Act of 1970, US citizens can see that the act's validity since Congress declared it a law and how it defines the strategy to reduce carbon emissions and pollution that comes about for the nation. Some agencies that are involved with the formation of this act. As mentioned in my intro, the Clean Air Act is monitored and policed by the EPA. The federal branch of our government provides resources and a financial budget to supplement the EPA's research efforts with the Clean Air Act. Considered as one of the most important and powerful government-related agencies in the US, the EPA is responsible for investigating pollution problems, implementing rules and regulations for corporations to reduce pollutant discharge into our environment. All of this is under the premise of power given to the EPA by the president, essentially acting like a group that is very similar to the president's executive cabinet. The EPA cooperates they cooperate with the federal government by providing year-to-year reports on how much funding they need to continue implementing the Clean Air Act. On top of this, they also provide reports so the government provides them with the funds necessary to continue research on ways to improve the quality of air, as well as protecting the environment. In order to ensure that the Clean Air Act is functioning and effective depends on the EPA's ability to regulate how much carbon dioxide and pollution is being released by corporations and companies and their production facilities. Through regulation of greenhouse gases, the EPA can then formulate different plans to reduce the amount of these gases being released into our atmosphere. Impacts on businesses. Due to the nature of the Clean Air Act of 1970 and how it limits the legal amount of pollutant able to be released by a specific business, big name production companies were hit the hardest. Many of these corporate giants began to lose their public support, causing them to lobby their point of view in congressional meetings, which is why we have a bunch of lobbyists nowadays. These corporations also called on their government official supporters to fight for them to oppose regulations and bills that essentially provide loopholes for these corporations, which kind of results in halting the EPA's efforts in fixing the current pollution predicament. With the goal of taking power away from the EPA, the government officials in Congress that supported the corporate giants made attempts to propose bills and propositions that would hinder the EPA's interests. Key point is that these officials would make it that the Clean Air Act cost too much for how ineffective the EPA was at regulating this law, as well as how expensive it was to fund the exploration of solutions while also monitoring research facilities. Trump was one of the most recent presidents that cut funding to the EPA, assuming that he's trying to assist these larger corporations and providing legal loopholes for them, but that's just my 2 cents. Impact on businesses continued. As the EPA began to accommodate these demands, small businesses in America began to suffer because they had to adjust to these new laws and regulations that the government implemented. While preventing the growth of these small businesses seemed to be a small setback, this in fact impacted the owners of these small businesses, which focused on moving production facilities to other countries rather than making an effort in reducing their carbon footprint in the US. Country names on product labels like made in Indonesia, Malaysia, or China were the result of companies that could not afford to reduce their carbon emissions because the companies outsourced their production to these countries. This loophole soon became popular. It was one of the ways to avoid regulations that the EPA imposed on American-based factories. Since these companies began to outsource their products, over 600,000 American jobs were essentially wiped out of existence. So why would companies want to produce less and make less if they could pay foreign employees less for more profit? These companies took advantage of this loophole not covered by the Clean Air Act and EPA, and essentially kind of cared more about making money rather than reducing their carbon footprint and pollution. Impact on society. A positive aspect of implementing the Clean Air Act was that citizens of the US had a significantly cleaner environment to live in. Through the application of the Clean Air Act, the EPA is responsible for promoting a healthier and improved air quality, as well as elongating the lives of the US citizens. After the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, however, the federal government required the EPA to find out whether spending so much of their portion of funds was effective. To their surprise, the EPA estimated that the act resulted in a 40% reduction in sulfur dioxide, 30% reduction in oxides of nitrogen, a 50% reduction in carbon monoxide, and a 45% reduction in total suspended particles. Source was Lockwood. Impact on society continued. In addition to the reduction of these harmful toxins in the environment, the EPA was also happy to announce that it was estimated to have an annual reduction of 184,000 premature deaths, 674 cases of chronic bronchitis, over 22 million lost days of work. Since the Clean Air Act's original purpose was to promote a healthier lifestyle by reducing our carbon footprint, I would say that the EPA did its job. In Dr. Josso's Ethics in Law and Society lectures, we were reminded that the philosopher Aristotle's view on ethics is not a theory, but a lifestyle in which we should subconsciously do the right thing and expect nothing in return. I believe that through the creation of the Clean Air Act, our society was saved from potential destruction and chaos that could have been if the EPA did not regulate carbon emissions. Since the implementation of the Clean Air Act of 1970, American society has reaped the benefits of improved health and a better quality of life. Policy analysis. Did the Clean Air Act work? Even though some corporations and small businesses discovered a loophole to avoid breaking any laws that the EPA created, along with any negative criticisms concerning its overwhelming costs, the Clean Air Act of 1970 is still one of our most successful implemented laws today, simply because it's still in effect. Since the creation of the EPA, along with the implementation of the Clean Air Act, carbon monoxide and dioxide levels have been proven to be reduced by values of nearly 50%. The advancement of the two major amendments in the Clean Air Act left a memorable moment in American history because the quality of air improved drastically. Chemical emissions affected the economy negatively due to shorter lifespans as well as an increased health risk, and is also responsible as one of the main influences in society's market failure. If we kind of take a look at the countries that struggle the most with population, the first country that kind of pops into mind is China. China is infamous when it comes down to pollution. Their inability to create clean air reforms has resulted in extremely hazardous living conditions, because not only are these factories polluting their own country, outsourced companies as well from all around the world are also stationed in China. Unlike China, the US has prioritized the quality of air in our country and has avoided a situation like China's, not only by alleviating our carbon footprint, but also creating a cleaner and safer society for us. Strengths. One of the more prominent features of the Clean Air Act is the federal branch of the US government's acceptance of the law itself. It's one of the most respected laws ever implemented by the US. It continues to observe and discover better ways to relieve the environment of our carbon footprint. An example of recent discovery is the creation of hybrid vehicles, running on both gasoline as well as electricity. According to afdp.energy.gov, hybrid vehicle sales went up from 50,000 sales per year in 2020 to over 500,000 sales per year. Only reason that sales increased by nearly 900% was that during the year 2005, the federal government actually offered tax incentives for people that purchased a hybrid vehicle from any licensed car dealership. Today, we have a lot of EV companies that have tax incentives, if you do choose to drive an EV vehicle. With the government incentive-based offers, it's evident that people are willing to make the switch from fossil fuel dependent cars to hybrid. And nowadays, like I said earlier, we have EVs. On the right is a little diagram of what SWOT analysis is. This is mainly used in business analysis, strength, weakness, opportunity, and threats. Helpful to achieve the goals are strengths and opportunities. Harmful to achieving objective is weakness and threats. Internal origins would be strengths and weaknesses, which would be attributes of the organization itself, and external origins would be attributes of external environmental factors that would affect opportunities and potential threats. Strengths continue. Upon further analysis of the results of the Clean Air Act, researchers discovered that with a society that is well informed about the quality of our environment, there will in turn be a positive outcome for the entire nation. According to nrcm.org, the US would save over $1.7 trillion from the years 2010 to the future of 2030 by cutting carbon emissions, and will also save corporations and small businesses over $470 billion per year. The per year monetary values that the Clean Air Act saves the US has steadily increased since the federal government allowed the EPA to implement this act in 1970. With this steady increase, there is no surprise that the general public will benefit greatly in the coming years. Some weaknesses of the act. Despite the strengths of this act outweighing the weaknesses, the flaws are significant enough for us to discuss. Being viewed as one of the older laws publicly, one must consider that there were amendments to change the 1970s version of the act, in turn making it more effective. Individuals that oppose the act assert that the longstanding Clean Air Act should be amended again to ensure loopholes are sealed off, and believe that the law itself is becoming less and less valid. An example of a problem that might come up during debate in Congress is that the EPA has no power over pollution traveling from one state to another. The only element responsible for this is the natural wind current, which would essentially carry these pollutants across state borders. Weaknesses continued. Another weakness is that although the federal government in the US successfully implemented the Clean Air Act, it does not help with the fight against pollution globally. One major setback that affected the world occurred in March of 2011, where a massive 9.0 earthquake triggered a massive tsunami to hit Japan, which destroyed a lot of nuclear facilities that poured out copious amounts of radioactive material. Once this radioactive waste entered the ocean, it slowly made its way towards the west coast of America and into the Pacific Ocean. Our federal government can do very little to contain the waste, and it essentially poisoned the waters of our nation. The EPA had no jurisdiction to devise immediate response programs to clean up this mess. The EPA has no power to quote unquote think outside the box and act on international quandaries. In order to fix this weakness to make it a strength, however, the EPA must be granted power and given an increased budget for spending on research and implementation of said programs to deal with pollution problems that do not originate from US soil. So policy recommendations. I believe the Clean Air Act of 1970 is indeed one of the more prominent and controversial laws in our US government. It's vital to our society because it limits the carbon emissions that businesses are allowed to release and also regulates our pollution percentages. Since the 1970s to our society today, the Clean Air Act has improved our country and enhanced our well-being. Even though the act has been beneficial to the US for a few decades, I believe that it is time to take this law and attempt to prepare for the unexpected. It is without a doubt that even though the EPA is key to reducing pollution levels, both the EPA and Clean Air Act of 1970 must be modernized to be applied to current world situations. With the effort of adapting to our world today, I believe they should work together with corporations to produce a program that benefits both the public and the corporations without holding the corporations back from growing. Policy recommendations continue. I know it's almost done. The common ground must be found between the corporation's interest and their responsibility of maintaining and reducing their carbon footprint while also being able to freely grow. That way, both the federal government and the corporations will be satisfied with the outcomes. By cooperating with US corporations and advancement of fixing pollution on a global scale, there's no stopping the Clean Air Act of climbing back to the top as being one of the most efficient laws implemented by our federal government. Conclusion. slide everybody's movie. Implementation of the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the creation of the EPA are both responsible for successfully reducing the chemical emissions in the US. It should be seen as an achievement for both the federal branch of our nation as well as the citizens of the US because it's met the needs and wants of both the government and its governed people. The Clean Air Act aided in reducing pollution by implementing regulations on over-excessive release of toxins into our environment and also encouraged the switch of fossil fuel dependent vehicles to hybrid and fully EV ones. This act also exposed the corporations that outsource for personal company gain and has informed the society of the health concerns that are raised if pollution does increase. If the research is accurate, by 2030, the US could possibly save both consumers and businesses more than 470 billion in healthcare and government investments, which would reduce the financial crisis of our government currently faces. But most importantly, the Clean Air Act of 1970 is the forefront of our country's future and has educated multiple generations of US citizens about preserving the air quality, the health standards, and economy of the US. I think that should be it. Yep, and those are my references. Yep. And that's it. Any questions? Well, there are a lot more than that.
The Republican president made that act.
The what?
It's finally the Republican president.
Yeah, surprisingly enough, but there was a lot of pushback. Yeah.
No, usually Republicans discourage the regulation on businesses.
Right.
And then this act is supposed to regulate.
Yep. And President Nixon kind of had a lot of pushback during the time. A lot of congressmen didn't believe in the sign. Congressmen and women.
He was the one who pushed for it.
Yeah, he was the one who pushed for this act to be implemented. So when it was approved in 1970, there were a couple of drafted versions, kind of like the inception of the Clean Air Act. Again, it wasn't accepted by Congress at that time, but because President Nixon kind of made it his campaign pushing point to have this, and I'm assuming it kind of brought the US citizens together and kind of got him to be elected again. Yeah. I wasn't alive back then, so I can't speak too much on that, but I would believe the reference. Yeah. Yes.
And what does America seems to have benefited from this, but what about the global view? Like, what are the current statistics? Like,
So,
right?
yeah, I would say as a whole, right now, it's still currently rising. The EPA does have a lot of strict guidelines for corporations, but again, a lot of larger corporations who are in the game for just money, kind of outsource to other countries. Yeah, kind of like China, Indonesia, Malaysia. I think Vietnam is a big producer of like clothes now as well. So they're kind of like, once they outsource these like companies and their production methods, then the EPA can't really regulate that unless they have a US based.
Is there a global
I
agency that?
don't believe there's a global agency. However, of course, things that would do with even like the UN and their pushes, although the UN kind of focuses on like global security. I think it's also on their radar for like how everybody in the world should kind of move towards reducing carbon emissions, pollution, and whatnot. I think the Olympics in China was kind of like that first or not first, but more recent kind of example of when the Olympic athletes went over there, they kind of noticed, oh, the air quality is a little bit worse than how they kind of imagined it. So they had kind of like temporary respiratory issues as far as like the non-Chinese participants, I guess, were more used to it. Whereas like in the US, like I know one of the like in the US basketball team, they're like, oh, it's a little bit hard.
Brazil too, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that's
Brazil, they also had that issue where I think it was like too hot or too big or something. But I think it is what it is in terms of Olympics, but for pollution in general, there has to be some global or worldly entity that's sort of pushing this. I'm pretty sure there's something out there right now, but
I think
just
that
off my.
Paris treaty.
Yeah, the Paris Accord, yeah, but then Trump kind of took us out of that. I'm not too sure why it is.
It's just agreement, there's no enforcement. So-
Yeah, it's more like on the paper, we agree to reduce, but there's no agency following up with it. No regulations that will technically hold them accountable legally. It's more of just like a friendly review, some sort of.
The problem with China is they only have coal.
Yeah.
They don't have gas or steel.
I know they're gonna get a lot of.
Because they can only depend on coal. Like, that's why there's a lot of
Full
coal.
fossil fuel.
It's not like they don't want to convert, they just don't have.
Russia has.
Fuel right now.
Yeah. But actually, it's kind of funny from United States point of view, brought all this production to China and now blame China for pollution. This is the real American way to do it.
I fully agree with that. If you look at the correlation between GDP growth and pollution, back in the old days, in the early 80s, Taiwan's GDP growth was in the range of about 10%. And if you would remember those time in Taipei, it's very smoggy. And go as far back as back in the industrial time, remember London is known as the city of fog, right? London fog. And a lot of those fog are from pollutions. And if you, more recently, if you go into China in the late 1990s to early 2000, it was also during that period of time where the GDP is in the teens, and look at the pollution. But if you go back to Taiwan, if anybody visited Taiwan lately, Taiwan's air is quite clean because GDP is growing at roughly about 2-3%. That's it. So yeah, that's a correlation there.
Yeah, there are a lot more regulations that they're.
And I think like it's a good to try to reduce the carbon dioxide like globally, but have you ever see from satellite how Earth look like according to like fire distribution? Fire, yeah. The nature of fire.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, no, not smoke, like fire, like you can see light from fire. I saw this video, like people make this kind of time lapse from satellite. It look like our Earth on fire all the time. It's just globally fire constantly burning like wood somewhere, like it's always. It means like we have a huge carbon dioxide emission from just fire, wildfire. And I think it's much more carbon dioxide came right now from wildfire compared with from like our cars. And other things like new car use like very efficient engine, has less pollution for carbon dioxide. The destruction of tire. Right now, like most like pollution from new car that has a like very efficient engine came from tire destruction, because like when you like for running tires, it just basically carbons like pollution like on the road. And another things like how you're gonna go so many electric cars to substitute the engine car. You have to have a lot of copper like for all the electric wireless. You need to have a lot of nickels for battery, and it's very like to just we don't have enough copper in the whole world to support so many vehicles. And another things like you don't have any way to like disposal electric battery right now. It's basically like what people do right now. They just put in the ground, and this is like basically contaminated ground at the same time. In this case, like right now, it's way how they do this, not exactly as it's supposed to do. In other things, like we need to have clean energy to support this electric, and only clean energy right now is a nuclear power. And like United States, they didn't put any penny right now for 30 years to develop new technology and nuclear power. There is no new nuclear power is building in the United States right now. Because last 30 years, they use like resources from Russia. Because Russia supply United States nuclear power for 30 years. Yeah. Because they basically destroyed weapons like Russia developed some kind of process to like this
Convert,
weapons like to like I think they just down concentrate or I don't know how to say it. It's in English, sorry guys. It's basically like they use basically like nuclear things like from missiles to just like ego power power station. In the United States now, now I don't know how they're gonna get like sources because it's basically 50% they get from Russia like, for the last 30 years. In this case, it will be so difficult now.
I think the motivation of this act is like around that time probably that's about. Because you see declare one cancer.
Yeah. The large.
And
like
since
asthma,
then,
respiratory.
the cancer incidence really has increased.
They make the correlation, cancer.
Because the cancer incident rate, when we talk about in academic, like, oh, we have like drugs in cancer research, that's why cancer incident rate go down. But this could be one reason that makes the incident rate bring down.
No, of course, we want to have reduce pollution locally,
Yeah,
like in a city or some around factories that produce something. But like most time, it's basically, yes, it depends on coal. Yeah, if you use coal to burn it to get energy.
unfortunately for China, there's no gas or there's no other energy than coal.
They just signed huge contract about, I don't know, it's billions dollars like this, like to get. And then they already built like 2 pipelines to China, and they're gonna build more. Because like right now, they cannot sell gas to Europe.
Well, China is the biggest country making produce the solar panels and wind turbines.
Yeah, they are trying to convert those energy.
And
Not efficient, it's
it
really.
has done so much. Actually, plant trees, rebuilding, restoring forestry, all those things. Done a lot.
How many people here drive electric cars? I just bought one because they reduce the price.
Well, so my wife is driving 25 miles one way.
The pollution of producing electricity is just shifting from coal going to house. Unless like say nuclear power or other renewable. Otherwise, we just shift from one pollution to another path. Yeah, and actually, I had a colleague before argument. That time not much electric car, and mostly hybrid. He said, I just don't believe the basic physics. You carry an electric engine and, running around, that's put more energy. It's like, you just made the electricity somewhere else.
The best is fuel cell. Fuel cell.
Fuel cell it is, but not many
Not
people.
water.
Yeah, that's it. Fuel cell, hydrogen.
Hydrogen space can be explosive, right?
Yeah.
And also how can make hydrogen nowadays, electrons.
Again, you have to purify that.
Unfortunately, hydrogen cannot be used widely because
Exactly.
metal is still
The basic
destroyed.
physics.
Your car should be in plastic.
The basic
Otherwise,
physics.
Toyota have that actually, right, yeah. The only one. So far. But this is the whole market. In the whole market, only hydrogen car, right?
Right now, it's still expensive.
On the market.
They don't want to invest in the mass production and mass production.
And another for hydrogen is how you're going to produce hydrogen, because there is 2 different ways to produce hydrogen. One from gas, and this is production always release a lot of carbon dioxide, In this case, it's not green hydrogen anymore at all. And another hydrogen, like that we can just get from water, need a lot of electricity to produce it because it's very, very, very.
This is the basic physics.
It's like- You still need to have electricity somewhere to get like
The
clear.
only solution is useless, the climate.
Yeah, and you cannot store hydrogen because you need to have low temperature, and you have to put a lot of energy to keep
And
it.
according to Winky, we should just eat no beef or something, right?
Right now, I think
The
like,
cow is the biggest problem.
exactly, because all this methane came from cow. It's more like basically a green gas, it's like for methane compared to CO2.
That's,
CO2 is nothing, like CO2 could be reused, methane, no.
a company making synthetic, so. synthetic,
I think in India, that, now it's gone, like, the Kou gas project with all this, we had this community presentation, the cow dump there. Like, it has been there, there should be project on that, I don't know. It's all like solar energy. So, but how the gas, everything about the. It's not very important.
So California has we have special green